All right, well, thank you very much. My name is Libby Ogard, and I wanted to start off by saying that I'm working on a very similar project that Posse just discussed in Minnesota. And what we call it is we call it FRED, which is Freight Rail Economic Development. Freight rail economic development is about building a virtuous circle of benefits. It starts with looking at lower transportation costs, which lead to more competitive industries, which what all state DOTs are looking for is more jobs, improved economic competitiveness, and lower costs for local consumers. Yet ultimately, the decision is made by the owner of the products, whether they're going to move by truck or rail or marine or any combination of those efforts. Significant institutional knowledge has been lost in the shipping community with respect to rail, and yet the railroad network today is not your father's railroad. It is very different. It has changed a lot. What we thought we knew in 2000 is different than 2005 with the Great Rail Renaissance. And then, of course, we dropped into recession, and it's yet different again today. So it is a dynamic industry that bears paying a lot of attention to. So what is the public role, and how do we begin the dialogue? I started our investigation for Minnesota by looking at and interviewing Richard Timmons and asking him what the key attributes of success are. And the way we started our project with Fred is to look at what can the states influence and control, which is primarily short lines, although short lines connect to the class ones, so the study was not limited to short lines only. So as state DOTs contemplate rail programs, usually their priorities center around mode conversion, highway preservation, job creation, balancing investments and or maintenance, and rail preservation. And short lines are often part of this solution. When we talked to Richard Timmons, he basically went through a laundry list of 7 important factors that tend to be predictors of success. So the size of the state agency and staffing, the agency's budget for rail, the rail association activity. In Michigan, you're very fortunate to have the Michigan Association of Railroads, who's very active. To my surprise, there are some states in the United States that don't have rail associations. Class 1 railroad participation, the presence of Class 1s, as well as their activity level is absolutely important, since they're the ones that are connecting the freight to the ultimate markets. He identified governor support. Some of the best examples are in Florida, as well as in Pennsylvania, where the governor actually participates in some site selection and trade program visits to other countries to try to promote exports and multimodal transportation. And last but not least, this is part of why all of you are in the room today, is the intellectual capacity or expertise and guidance outside of the DOT and the specific rail network. So that's consultants. It's people that had served or worked with the railroad for 30 or 40 years and are now retired and basically are interested in the program. So the first consideration when looking at railroads is that they are networks, yet many of the state DOTs, and for very good reasons, often focus within their own states. And one of the challenges here is looking at, as we talked about earlier today, intermodal terminal development. Intermodal terminals do not reside within a state, they reside within a network, and networks compete. So these are very surgical decisions. These are decisions that take a lot of thinking about what does the function of that intermodal terminal provide. Is it an endpoint? Is it in-network terminal? How close is it, and how does it impact network reliability as well as total transit time end to end? Michigan also competes with neighboring states for freight rail development, and those networks also impact the investments that Michigan makes. So Michigan For example, benefits based on investments that are made in Indiana as the Michigan network connects to Chicago or other locations. So what freight opportunities are most likely to benefit from freight rail economic development, specifically on short line railroads? If we look at the Short Line Railroad Association, and this is a comparison of December 2012 versus December 2011, these are some of the top suspects to begin your screening process with. From a chemical standpoint, railroads are among the safest mode that's out there. From an intermodal standpoint, we're seeing a lot of interest in development, particularly in some small or smaller intermodal facilities, for example, Decatur, Chippewa Falls, Indiana Railroad Transload, which Tom will talk about more, as well as some of the traditional commodities. What I put in this slide is I want you to specifically focus on the last two products, metals as well as paper products, are in decline on the short line system. And this is very important for Michigan, given your commodity base and your customer base. I wanted to point out another kind of some small factoids that I thought were interesting. Wisconsin Department of Agriculture did a survey of 30 firms located on publicly owned rail systems. So for those of you that are familiar in Wisconsin, a lot of the rail in Wisconsin is owned by the state. And what they identified is that 60% of those companies surveyed had 50 or fewer employees. So often when people think about freight rail economic development, they're thinking about the really big companies like Dow or like some of these other large companies. But don't lose sight of some of these smaller facilities that might have 50 or fewer employees. 41% of the companies are 25 years old or newer. So a lot of people, often when they're looking at freight rail economic development, are looking at legacy companies. Don't be confused. Many new companies are also getting into the rail game as well. 58% of the survey said that mode conversion is somewhat to very difficult. So if they lost rail service, it would be very likely that they would have to move or relocate. This is kind of an interesting slide that talks about Class 2 and Class 3 railroad carloads that are interchanged to the Class 1 railroads. And this is a database that the Short Line Association has been keeping for the last couple years. And what I think is a couple of important takeaways from this slide is that, for those of you that are really fast in math, this is about 4.3 million carloads a year. Of that, we're seeing, obviously in 2006 was at the beginning or the middle part of the rail renaissance. We tanked with the recession. We're starting to see an economic renaissance and a resurgence in terms of the rail carloads. I think the other part here is that the Western railroads are handling much more transload and short line traffic than a lot of the Eastern ones. This is also an advantage, even though Michigan's Class 1 railroads might be starting from a lower base, they're also focused on growth. And Class 1s have various approaches to short line growth and support. Of note, as I mentioned earlier today, BNSF is working very hard to include all short line station codes in their master routing network so that you can look at a shipment that might start or end on a short line and then go to start or end on a Class 1 network. NS is one of the best in terms of the mentoring program and the support that they offer for short line development. While this is an eye chart, I think that it's important to look at regional performance and benchmarking your states. So this is sort of the takeaway here is know your neighbors. Freight rail economic development is not necessarily about just moving freight within your state, but it's also moving freight across state lines and to your neighbors. Michigan ranks 7th in terms of total mileage within this cluster. So this cluster is the top group that is basically our Great Lakes neighboring states. I also included 4 additional states here that I would benchmark as some of the best in class. Now, there are a couple that are missing from here, but essentially in April this year, with the Minnesota Freight Rail Economic Development Project, we brought in 10 state DOTs for a day-and-a-half session and basically had a discussion about rail preservation, rail economic development, finance, and all these other types of things that states can get involved with to try to help with mode conversion. What I wanted to point out is, for example, in Michigan, you have about 41% of your railroad network is small railroads. And yet, all of the rail combined, when we look at mode conversion or what would otherwise move on highway if the railroads weren't in the state, is about an annual cost of about $37 million estimated pavement damage savings. So working with short lines and class ones on mode conversion can have significant economic benefit. So with this, the three key messages that we've come up with in our Minnesota product is talking about the rail renaissance. There is a tremendous amount of interest in rail, not only due to the energy push that we're seeing, Minnesota being next to North Dakota, but also in terms of regulatory issues that are impacting the capacity of other modes. Collaboration is key. No freight planning happens in a vacuum. We need to work with the customers, we need to work with the state DOTs, we need to work with the ports and economic development communities. One of the specific outreach projects that we did in Minnesota is visited with the EDM organization, which is the Economic Development Association of Minnesota. And we sat down and had a roundtable and asked every single economic development association what kind of challenges they were faced with. And I was surprised. No two were the same. It was like dogs and cats, and it was really hard with the 35 or 36 individual people that had the opportunity to say, what were they struggling with? They were struggling with an entire variety of things that was really hard to connect the dots on. Another thing that we're working on is from a perspective of maps. I mean, Posse showed you the maps and sort of the freight that they looked at. What we did is we approached it on a county-by-county basis, looked at inbound and outbound, but yet expressed that tonnage as a percent of, what is the rail percent of total volume in and out of that county. So we could kind of get an idea of mode conversion and where some of the highest opportunities or the low-hanging fruit might be. We also are working on a rail shipper toolkit that is trying to help educate kind of rail issues for non-rail audiences. And again, we had the peer review. So with that, I'd like to ask my tech guy if we can kick off the video. And maybe I can do it, but maybe not. Red one.
Railroads are now experiencing a renaissance. That renaissance is bringing back rail as a vital piece of the freight movement industry here in the state of Minnesota. Short lines, regionals, and Class 1 railroads form a network that allow Minnesota farmers, Minnesota ethanol producers, food processors, aggregate haulers, you name it, to be able to move within the state of Minnesota, across the nation, and to the world, simply because they've got railroad connections. We can't forget that the trucking industry and highways are a critical piece of the way we move freight in this state. But they connect to the railroads, and the railroads also connect to the ports, and that's how we move all the freight that has to move through the state of Minnesota, in and out.
Minnesota needs to recognize the fact that our business community, as well as our policymakers, that rail is an integral part of our transportation system. Even though they are private enterprises, that is one of the strengths that we have. We're not investing in the Class 1s to transport all this cargo like we are with the interstates and roads. And the short lines may need some capital assistance. It's for the public benefit. And we get a better return on that public investment than we do in a lot of areas, in rural roads and facilities and rest areas and things of that sort, because we rely upon goods movement and the railroads to get our materials the most efficient way possible to where they need to be. The importance of rail can't be
overstated. Rail plays a very key part in the movement of goods, and without the rail system that we have, not only within states, but on a regional and national level, really fills a big gap and, connects the entire United States and gets it to the point where, the trucking industry can take it that last mile and get it to the final delivery point. It's part of the seamless integrated multimodal transportation network.
And our story's a great one. It really is. We have good jobs, well-paying jobs. We're good for the environment. We're good for reducing congestion on the roads. All those things are positives, and it's a very, very strong story. We just need to tell it better.
The purpose of this video, as well as the is to post on the website not only for the Economic Development Association, but for the short line. Expand the reach of education. One of the things
Minnesota DOT really needs to continue working with and educating the management within the DOT of the importance of rail, freight movement, what it means to the economy, and then working with the folks that actually ship and also operate the rail transportation companies. They all have to work together.
Making sure that all the different agencies within the state that are involved in rail and economic development related to rail are communicating and talking to each other, whether that's through summits or monthly, annual meetings, but basically assuring that communication and dialogue is taking place across a wide range of agencies.
Let's engage, because I think freight rail really does have a lot of value, but if you have people in there that don't understand that, then how can they very well promote it?
Remember to customer think. So long as we customer think, so long as we think, where does that movement have to go? So long as we think, where does that particular industry need, where are their customers and where do we need to take their goods, we'll be able to develop industry in this state.
To get the rail companies involved as early as possible. That was one of the biggest pitfalls that was mentioned across states was not getting the railroads involved early enough, including the example of facilities being built and then saying, okay, let's get the rail set up. It doesn't really work that way.
The one thing I really, really liked was partnering with the shippers and the railroads to get an idea on what they're planning to do and maximizing your projects and program to fit each other's outcomes.
Understanding how they interact and what you can do and whether or not rail can actually drive economic development instead of just responding to it. I think understanding that better is really the most important thing.
I think the variety and the whole idea of helping people get access to the rail system and show them the benefits that it can have for them is a real lofty goal.
The statistics are, for the last 8 or 9 years, is that carload growth on short lines has actually been growing at a faster rate than
big railroads. And part of that's because of the customer focus that the small railroads have. And the secret to their success, at least in my opinion, is they're small businesses. So they're close to the customer, they're responsive, they're focused on that. Everything they do is very similar to what the big railroads do, the same type of locomotives and the same type of cars and the same gauge of track. But it's really that customer focus and being a small business and the flexibility that comes with that.
For the longest time, we were trying to play catch up. And, it was hard for us and for our short lines to determine what the future was going to look like in order to set themselves up to be able to do that. We now have a better understanding, so we can look toward future development, fund what we need now to help us in the future. So I think keeping abreast of those issues are going to be a big thing for Minnesota.
To me, it's customer service. I mean, if you can provide the customer service, you'll attract the customers, and that's economic development. That makes both of us are winners.
I think the biggest thing that Minnesota could do is exactly that. Expand the flexibility of funds, and that really is limited by the funding source. If bond funding is the only available funding, we work to find the opportunities that are best for that. If there are other sources of funding that are more flexible, that's allows MnDOT indeed to respond to projects differently.
Make sure that the people that you're trying to help have a financial stake in the outcome, that they're not counting on you for all of the funding, that they can do some of the work, a majority of it, on their own.
Making sure that Minnesota has very detailed guidelines and policies regarding their program, and to make sure it's documented. For the longest time, Pennsylvania did not have that. It's only been in the past couple of years that we have done it. The other thing they need to do is when they're developing those, to get their short lines and their other stakeholders involved in helping to shape that framework.
I think the other thing, and somebody alluded to it earlier, and that is think a little bit bigger. If all you come up with is $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 projects, that's all you're ever going to get. And you're not going to do a lot with $200,000 or $300,000. Most of the rail projects that we look at are probably like in the $5 million category. And I think you need to raise that bar so that when you're telling people about what needs to be done, you're actually talking projects that accomplish something.
So I think there's a lot of things in statute that limit what we can do. For instance, the Minnesota Rail Service Improvement Fund, it's a loan fund, and right now it's limited to $200,000. Well, at today's price as a shipper, can only put in one switch and very little rail. And that doesn't really do it for the shipper for the amount of legwork they need to do to prove they qualify for the loans.
I think the most important thing about rail economic development is to recognize that there are a lot of industries that either are dependent upon rail traffic or can benefit from rail traffic and actually improve their transportation costs and efficiency. That means that if we can promote rail development in the state of Minnesota, we will gain new businesses here that we didn't have in the state before, and new expansion. So that is the prime takeaway.
Okay, Libby, please don't leave quite yet. We have a token of appreciation we'd like to share. Thank you very much for being with us today.